Greetings to you all, and welcome to another installment of Midnight Responses. The featured content creator once again is Brian Holdsworth, easily the most respectable among traditional Catholic YouTubers. And the video in question is entitled Secret Catholic Teachings Nobody Knows. Of course, the full video will be linked in the description below, and in this episode, I'll really just be focusing on some highlights, and particularly the third and final teaching that Brian covers. All right, let's get started, shall we?
I think most Catholics can admit that we have a serious deficit of understanding in the church, which is why a lot of Catholics just don't know the essential basics of what we believe, let alone some of the more neglected teachings of the church. This is also compounded by the fact that every generation has like their pet virtues and pet ideas that are trendy, basically, and that they tend to nurture while neglecting certain other ones that are less popular. Which is why C.S. Lewis said that if you have to decide between reading new books and old books, you should choose the old books because they will contain wisdom that is often neglected by the contemporary age that you live in. And this has definitely been my experience of reading older Catholic books and teachings and like magisterial texts. In my experience, it has been like rediscovering Catholicism all over again because we definitely have fallen prey to the temptation to neglect what other generations have emphasized as critically important teachings, either because they accuse us of vices that are common today and therefore would easily offend us, or because we're too at home in the world, something Jesus warned us not to let happen. And in my experience, you really only have two ways of avoiding this narrow understanding of your faith. Either you pick up old books and you start studying, or you benefit from modern media that will help catechize you in teachings you are otherwise unfamiliar with. Because you won't hear these things discussed in a homily or a typical parish-run catechetical program. In my experience, a lot of the times I was introduced to these kinds of teachings and concepts or these neglected teachings was through podcasts and YouTube channels and Catholic Answers Radio and things like that. So that's why I'm aiming to contribute some of that in my efforts.
I'll begin with a point of agreement here with Brian. I believe he is correct in identifying the problem where the younger generation may be so enamored with a cutting edge at the expense of old wisdom, which deserves to be unearthed and re-examined. This is an issue in religion, philosophy, art, music, literature, and much more. But I would caution against an excessive deference to tradition, as some wisdom may have been based on faulty knowledge or old neurotic taboos, as we shall see later in this video. Ideally, we ought to balance an appreciation for time-tested wisdom while integrating newfound data and experience. Traditional Catholics should be wary of a prevalent resistance to the new. Now in this video, Brian focuses on three relatively unknown Catholic teachings. I'll summarize the first two briefly, but I really wanted to focus on the third one. The first teaching that Brian brings up is the forgotten and serious sin of usury, which is essentially charging interest on loans. And boy, does this plague our society today. And the next teaching is a fascinating one. The fact is, after death, we are no longer human. And that is because the fullness of our humanity is a body and soul composite. But after passing away, we become disembodied intellects and wills. It is not until the final resurrection, where our soul is reunited with a glorified body, that our humanity is restored. This represents the best of Catholic theology, which, contrary to popular misunderstanding, elevates the dignity and importance of the human body. I'm going to skip ahead to 10:08 in the video, where Brian gets into the main topic I wanted to comment on.
Okay, number 3 is that the ends or purpose, if you prefer, of the conjugal act in marriage is procreation. So if you came of age as a fledgling Catholic in the era of theology of the body, like I did, then you will have heard over and over again that the purpose of sex is the twofold procreation and union of the spouses, which is that it's true. But if that's all that is said, then that's not the whole truth, because these two ends are not equal, going all the way back to St. Augustine, up until the Middle Ages with St. Thomas, and all the way up to through the centuries in canon law and the theological manuals, until it was synthesized by Pope Pius XI in his encyclical Casti Connubii. It was taught that the primary purpose of the conjugal act is procreation, and that the secondary ends are the mutual love of spouses and the relief of concupiscence, which isn't something I was clearly taught in the theology of the body days, even though I took a lot of interest in trying to learn and understand the topic as someone who was about to get married, with both my wife and I being recent converts who really wanted to get this right. Concupiscence being another word that you don't hear much today in the church. So concupiscence describes our fallen passions, which direct us towards sin. It's like this gravitational pull towards evil. In the case of our sexual appetites, we are tempted towards lust. But marriage, going all the way back to the Bible, was described as like a relief for those passions, a way to direct them towards a good rather than sin. That good being procreation and marital love. But again, procreation is primary and marital love secondary. And I think a confusion that a lot of people have is that either of these goods will do. So I can frustrate the procreative side by using something like natural family planning, like a natural form of contraception, to effectively avoid procreation at all costs. And it doesn't matter because we're still honoring the other purpose, which is our marital union. But the unitive ends are subordinate to the procreative. The unitive are secondary and the procreative primary. Every conjugal act, not just the marriage in general, but every act has to be open to life and procreation. Now, that doesn't mean that every time spouses come together that they should get pregnant. That would be absurd, of course. But it does mean that we can't persist in a pattern of avoiding pregnancy at all costs without persistent, serious reasons. So Pius does admit that in cases of economic necessity or health, couples can remain abstinent during periods of fertility to avoid pregnancy, but that such circumstances should be with serious motives. But then he leaves it up to us to decide what constitutes serious motives. So those are three that I can think of, and I can think of a lot more. But if you can think of some, I'd love to read them in the comments below.
To summarize, Brian correctly represents the traditional Catholic view that sex and marriage are built on the primacy of procreation. Now, following this ivory tower logic, a number of problems arise. These teachings are so at odds with the lived experience of the majority of the human race across time and culture. The need for sexual expression and exploration is often unintelligently and wrongly dismissed as lust or concupiscence. Now, to be sure, concupiscence is absolutely a problem when you consider the prevalence of addiction to pornography or compulsive masturbation and participation in hookup culture. I'm not denying the reality of sexual sin, but in the context of long-term monogamy, and especially marriage, this traditional Catholic view flattens the rich experience of love and romance, and hyper-focuses on the integrity of the sexual act in a legalistic and mechanical way. Among the many skeletons in the closet of traditionalist theology is the fact that our sexual ethics were largely built on the teachings of historical figures that had, to put it mildly, a problematic view or relationship with sex, starting with St. Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they so continue even as I. But if they do not contain themselves, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to be burnt. St. Augustine, who is notorious for his hedonistic life, eventually retreated into a kind of Manichaean neuroticism, where, even though he didn't say sex was bad, his attitude about sexual pleasure was more or less that it was a minor sin to be tolerated for the good of procreation. St. Jerome, the church father responsible for the Latin Vulgate, was also marked by a visceral disgust of sex. Counseling a young widow in his circle not to remarry, he said, "You've already learned the miseries of marriage. It's like unwholesome food, and now that you have relieved your heaving stomach of its bile, why should you return to it again, like a dog to its vomit?" And lastly, the saint who is perhaps most responsible for the legalism of bedroom matters, St. Alphonsus Liguori, was rumored to have had a rather problematic relationship with the use of his left hand, which he tied behind his back. Now, truth be told, I have not been able to verify this academically, but I did hear this legend from a trusted priest. What's the common theme here? All of these great figures in the church sadly pathologize human desire. They feel burdened by it, and they assume that others are burdened by it. Unless it is subordinate to reproduction, it is somehow ignoble or disgusting or sinful. However, what could be more animalistic than merely procreating without love and only with a concern for the mechanics of the act? It is precisely our ability to enjoy and express and shape our sexual experiences that make them particularly human. The uber-traditional Catholic view on sex perpetuates a neurotic and suffocating culture around it. And it very likely creates a family environment that's burdened by paranoia and neuroticism and frigidity. Church sexual ethics are still largely safeguarded by celibate clergy who are inescapably out of touch with the experiences of everyday people. And they wage war on a so-called contraceptive mentality, which, while there is some truth to that notion, it's a gross overgeneralization of the state of modern sexuality, something that I'll elaborate on in another video. I myself have to confess guilt for misjudging many of my friends and peers. I had wrongly assumed that they were all hedonists, unguided by religion, having premarital sex, liberally using contraceptives. And while that might have been true, so many of them have still chosen marriage and family, and they are still having kids. Along the way, they just had more opportunities for growth and more tools to shape their path to family life. Another interesting point that Brian mentions is how NFP, or natural family planning, can be used as a sort of natural contraceptive. And that opens a whole nother can of worms in the debate about birth control and what should be licit or illicit. For more on that conversation, check out the Uncharted Catholic Man podcast. And as exaggerated as this sounds, I can honestly say it's the one Catholic podcast that makes an authentic space for freedom of speech. No one who shows up on that podcast will be canceled. All perspectives are openly welcome, and there's a genuine interest in dialogue. One thing that Brian leaves out is that in traditional Catholicism, the vast number of infractions against the sexual ethic are considered mortal sins, which means they imperil the soul, compelling you to go to confession before participating in the sacrament of Holy Communion. This basically corners you into having to make some of the most intimate and private decisions of your married life, weighed down by the fear of hell. And that is just spiritually unsustainable. Even if we hold the traditional Catholic model as the ideal, we shouldn't be threatened at every turn of our married lives with hell. It is spiritually, emotionally, and psychologically destructive. Anyway, I'll call it there for now. Once again, I wish to reiterate, I really do enjoy Brian's videos. He's well-spoken, he's considerate, he's thoughtful, and I look forward to engaging with more of his content. He really is an exception among traditional Catholic YouTubers who can sometimes be a little bit too grim and judgmental. I think he truly represents the best among them, and this will certainly not be the last time I share his content and respond to it. Until the next one, this is Midnight Philosopher, signing out.